Imagine this. All across India, you have these giant stone pillars and massive rock faces, and they're covered in ancient writing. But for centuries, nobody on Earth could read a single word. It meant entire chapters of history. Everything from the commands of great emperors to the simple notes of ordinary people were just gone, locked away in a code that seemed absolutely unbreakable. Well, this is the story of how that code was finally cracked.
All right, so here's our game plan for this incredible detective story. First up, we're going to get a feel for just how much history was lost. Then, we'll open up the toolkit the Codebreakers used. After that, we'll take on the oldest cold case of them all, the Harappan Enigma. Then comes the big moment, cracking the code. And finally, we'll get to hear the voices in stone that have been silent for thousands of years.
So let's start at the beginning with this profound silence. An entire civilization's history written down, but totally, completely lost. I mean, just think about that for a second. For centuries, this was the reality in India. You had these majestic pillars, huge boulders, old coins, all covered in writing. They were like silent witnesses to a past that was just gone. You could see that they were important messages, but what they actually said, it was a complete and total mystery.
And this historical amnesia, it ran deep. Back in the 14th century, the Sultan of Delhi found this ancient pillar covered in inscriptions and had it brought to his capital. He gathered the smartest scholars in the entire kingdom to try and read it. And you know what? Not a single one could make any sense of it. The language of their own ancestors had become completely alien. The knowledge was just gone.
So how do you even begin to solve a puzzle like that? Well, you need the right tools. So let's open up the Codebreakers toolkit and look at the science that lets us read the past. The number one tool in our kit is a field called paleography. It's basically the forensics of ancient texts. A paleographer is like a detective who studies how the shapes of letters change over hundreds of years. This lets them not only read the old writing, but it also lets them figure out when and where it was written, sometimes with incredible accuracy. Now, paleography doesn't work alone. It's part of a team. You've got epigraphy, which focuses on inscriptions that are carved into hard stuff, like stone or metal. Then there's manuscriptology, which deals with texts written on things that don't last as long, like palm leaves or paper. So you can think of it like this. Paleography tells us how the letters were written, and these other fields help us figure out the what and the where. But before we get to the amazing story of the code that was cracked, we have to talk about the one that wasn't. This is India's oldest unsolved case, the Harappan Enigma.
So the first clue we have is the number of signs. Scholars have found around 450 unique symbols. Now, that's way too many for a simple alphabet like ours, but it's not nearly enough for a system like Chinese, where there's a character for every single word. It's in this weird middle ground, which suggests it's a mix of symbols for words and symbols for sounds, what experts call a logosyllabic system.
So why haven't we cracked it? Well, we're up against some huge roadblocks. For one, the inscriptions are incredibly short, like 4 or 5 signs on average. Imagine trying to understand all of modern English by only reading Twitter hashtags. Good luck, right? Second, we have no idea what language these people even spoke. And the biggest problem of all, there's no Rosetta Stone. We don't have a single text written in both the Harappan script and a language we already know. It is still one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world.
And that brings us to the climax of our story. Cracking the code. This is the moment one man found the key that would finally unlock an entire civilization's lost history. So the whole effort really gets going with the founding of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. But the real hero of this story is a guy named James Prinsep. He starts off by tackling a different script, Kharosthi, kind of like a warm-up. And he uses this brilliant trick. He finds these old coins that have Greek writing on one side and Kharosthi on the other. That was his in. And then, just 2 years later, he pulls off the impossible. He cracks Brahmi. Look, it's impossible to overstate how massive this was. Cracking Brahmi didn't just solve one puzzle, it threw open the floodgates. Prinsep's discovery made it possible to read nearly every other ancient inscription in India. He's called the father of Indian epigraphy for a reason. After centuries of silence, the stones could finally speak. So why was this one decipherment so revolutionary? Well, it's because Brahmi is the mother script. It's basically the great-great-grandmother of almost every script used across India today, and even into Southeast Asia. So cracking Brahmi wasn't like finding a key to just one room, it was like finding the master key to the entire library.
So the code was broken. The library was finally open. So what did we find inside? Let's take a listen to these voices in stone.
An incredible variety of records suddenly came to light. And what's really cool is that the materials they used tell their own story. If you were a king and you wanted your message to last forever, you carved it in stone. If it was a legally binding document, like a land grant, you'd etch it onto copper plates. But for everything else, like manuscripts or letters, you'd use stuff that was easier to carry around, like palm leaves down in the south or birch bark up north.
And you can literally see history changing just by looking at a single letter. See how it starts in Ashokan Brahmi? Super simple, no line on top. A few centuries later, in the Gupta period, a little hat, a headline appears. Then the letter gets a bit more angular, a little tilted. And finally, you get to modern Devanagari, where that headline connects all the letters in a word. That right there is the magic of paleography.
And what we recovered was the full spectrum of life. We rediscovered the story of the great emperor Ashoka, a man who was almost completely lost to history. Suddenly, his edicts about peace and tolerance were readable all across the country. But it wasn't just about the big, grand narratives. We also found simple, incredibly human messages, like the names of ordinary pilgrims who just carved their names onto a cave wall wanting to say, "I was here."
The decipherment of Brahmi was a monumental achievement. But the story isn't over. That Harappan script is still a locked time capsule, its secrets just waiting for a key. It's a powerful reminder that for all we know about the past, there are still these huge mysteries out there, waiting for the next brilliant codebreaker. What lost world are we just one discovery away from finally revealing?